Hello and welcome to BYJU'S Exam Prep IAS. As part of your comprehensive news analysis today, we'll be discussing 7 important articles out of the Hindu newspaper itself. But before we begin, let's look at the topics we'll cover today. Good morning to all of you. First, we'll discuss a very ingenious and very interesting way of talking about climate change, an editorial article. Thereafter, we'll talk about the monsoons and how has the monsoons fared generally. This is important for you to know that was it an El Nino year or was it a deficit or a positive year, because that will allow you to write better answers for environment. And last but not the least, we'll talk about what has happened in Sikkim. Very, very dangerous conditions and a glacial lake outburst flood, as it is called, the GLOP, that has actually GLOF, which has happened recently just on 4th of October. And very, very problematic when it comes to what were the warning signs there and how do we mitigate that is equally important. Thereafter, we'll talk about 4 very simple but straightforward Prelims Bytes section, wherein we'll talk about the Nobel Prize in Chemistry. Thereafter, weapons understanding of what the government of India wants further. Thereafter, we'll talk about green shipping, a word which has been used in the newspaper. Last but not the least, a very old scheme, Ujjwala scheme, but there's a revision in that. These are mains plus prelims oriented. These are more prelims oriented. And the basic point is, here we'll talk about the theoretical knowledge. I have 2 questions for you out of the first 3 topics in the end, and do like, share and subscribe to our YouTube and Telegram channel. You will also get 5 to 6 questions out of whatever I do in the next 1 hour on the Telegram channel, so you can go and subscribe to that and also attempt those questions. Now with this, as always, I will first give you the gist of the article, then we'll go into the nitty-gritty, and then I'll give you the summary. So in the same 1 hour, I will be teaching you something. Along with that, we'll revise. So let's begin our analysis with carbon accounting. It's an interesting article coming in with perspectives which we don't really talk about. And let's talk about these terminologies, and this will help you write a better answer when it comes to mitigation in GS paper 3, specifically of climate change. So let's first talk about the major words which were used. So the first is polycrisis. It's a very interesting word. This is not a word really, but bringing 2 words together. Poly means multiple, crisis is crisis, and therefore polycrisis is a word which is used and can be seen and could be seen in the newspaper and generally the examination also. The polycrisis of climate change and how do we mitigate that. Now please pay attention, this is where you have to understand it well. When I talk about polycrisis, this is not something new, but the terminology is new, which is the multiple dimensions of how climate change impacts us. We all can agree that climate change does not have just standard physical impact, which is what we see around us. It has physical, which is environmental, but also political, social, and economic impact. This we've discussed previously in multiple CNAs in classes, that when it comes to climate change, there's a cost, from tomatoes becoming very, very expensive, from the way we are now consuming our food grains, the crises when it comes to certain crops, in turn leads to poverty and internal issues in India, and therefore it also creates the political context for certain politics to be done. Very simply, climate change is not just one, but a multi-dimensional aspect to its impact, and therefore polycrisis is the multiple crises what climate change produces in the environmental sector also, in the political sector, in the social and the economic. And this means that climate change has a multi-sectoral impact, wherein from agriculture to health to infrastructure, and with Sikkim and Uttarakhand and Himachal Pradesh, we can see that extreme weather events which are based on climate change. Sikkim is a very good example of climate change based disaster which has happened just 1 day back, which is the aspect related to how with climate change comes major changes in the environment. That in turn leads to a multi-sectoral impact once a disaster is imminent or strikes us. So therefore, you have agriculture, health, infrastructure, the issues related to transportation, communication, all things come together. The crisis compounds together. And therefore, the multi-sectoral impact, the compounding of all the different aspects of crises is what we call as polycrisis. This is the first thing which you need to understand, which is what do we mean by polycrisis. Polycrisis is something wherein multiple crises created by multi-dimensional impact of climate change, which is environmental, political, social, economic. And this is something which you would be reading in your static, in your current affairs, wherein there's a cost for climate change when it comes to everything. This is the first thing which you need to understand. And I hope you get the terminology, because now this can be sprinkled around in any of the paper, be it prelims or mains. You should know what it means in that regard. So, this is not something new, wherein we know that there is multi-sectoral impact. Now, how do we tackle it? Which is mitigation. And herein, the answer given by this article is quite unique and in a way also a little bit too over the top or utopian, in the sense that it talks about the concept of carbon flow management from the panchayat level to the district, to the state, to the nation. So what this article is talking about is a concept of national carbon accounting. National carbon accounting, which is that very simply, how we calculate our budgets, fiscal, revenue, primary deficits. We also now need to budget our carbon emissions. So carbon inflow and outflow should be monitored. Over and above that, what is more important is carbon inflow and outflow should be also linked to progressive carbon taxation. This is what is the real point of this article, wherein if you emit too much, you should be taxed, and if you have a surplus, you should be given certain type of rebates. And it is talking about interportability between a carbon surplus and budget surplus, wherein if I am actually carbon surplus, I should get credits in the form of economic incentives. Now, national carbon accounting is a very good term. It's a very good hi-fi term that we account for all carbon emissions. But the carbon inflow and outflow they are talking about is from the individual level to the household level to the what we call as district level, then to the state level, and then to the national level. Now the problem is, how do you do this type of accounting is something which has not been worked out. So it's a good concept that, okay, there's a poly crisis and we need a holistic approach. And that holistic approach is that we need not just talk about green projects, which let's talk about carbon accounting, how there is accounting in income tax and taxation. Let's do carbon emission accounting, carbon footprint accounting in that regard. That is the word which they should have used, they haven't. The carbon footprint of a person, how much emission that person is doing, inflow outflow should be accounted for, and we should have two types of taxes. One is income tax, second is carbon tax, wherein if you emit, if I am purchasing maximum 20 liters of petrol in a month, I should not be taxed. But if somebody is actually taking thousands of liters or even 200 liters a month, he should pay a tax or she should pay a tax. That is progressive carbon taxation. How you have progressive taxation? Progressive carbon taxation, the bigger the emitter, the more you take from him. Now, as I said, idea is good. Seems to be also the answer to understanding per capita carbon emissions. But the point is, how do you do it? Nobody knows. That has not been talked about. The RBI has been talked about. The aspects related to budgeting have been talked about. But how do you enforce something like this on the ground level? There is no answer to that question. And if we think like IAS officers, if we think like administrators, think of the administrative nightmare it would be to do it. Because then how do I account for, as an individual, my carbon emission? Everything which I do should not be accounted for, or how will it be accounted for? How can there be misinformation? How does a household get taxed? Then how does an individual get taxed? Who in that household will get taxed? These are very big questions. For a corporate, it makes sense. For an emitter, it makes sense. For an iron steel plant, you know it is the company you are going to catch. But for an individual, how do you account for something which is basically invisible? So carbon emission, they are saying that the invisibility of carbon emission should be given visibility. But how do you do that? Again, makes no sense. So the simple straightforward point is, this can be pushed in as a concept in your answer. The examiner will get to know that you read the Hindu newspaper, but the logistics of doing something like this is beyond the capacity of the government right now. Further, if you have been following the larger per capita expenditures or climate change narrative, we in India are actually, the carbon footprint and carbon emission per capita is already very low. So what is the point of putting a burden on the citizenry already having a tax burden over and above direct and indirect taxes? Now there's one more tax. So good idea, seems to be an answer for all our issues. But how do we implement it is a different thing. As I said, and as I have already told you, there are different types of articles in the newspaper. One is giving you this problem, one is giving you the solution. Here the problem we already know, solution is in a way right now unrealistic. However, if we can implement it, it would be something which could work out in the longer perspective or in the larger perspective. So this is the basic point of this article, and then I'll now go into the nitty-gritty. I'll repeat what we've done till this point. Polycrisis is a word which they've used, which is the more interesting part, more relevant part for your preparation. Polycrisis related to climate change, multiple actors and multiple sectoral impact and multi-dimensional impact on the environment, on the physical, the political, the social and the economic. How do we mitigate it? Carbon flow management from the panchayat till the district to the state to the national level. Further, carbon inflow outflow management, progressive carbon taxation, and National Carbon Accounting Agency, apex body, whatever you want to create. But how do you do it is not something which the article is talking about. This is the basic point which this article is talking about. Let's now go into the nitty-gritty. Let's talk about the finer details in that regard. So, the term polycrisis encompasses the physical impact of climate change, rising temperatures, the sea level rising, extreme weather events, plus the social, economic and political. And therefore, in India, for example, it means that it has interconnected impact or multi-sectoral impact, wherein energy, infrastructure, health, migration, food production all get impacted by climate change. And therefore, we need to imagine a carbon infrastructure that creates opportunities for a new carbon regime that takes into flows of carbon into account at the household, panchayat, district, state and country level. Which again, as I said, is a very good big idea, but does not really seem to be realistic when it comes to implementation. Now, what is the approach? For them, the first step to any poly or what we call as multi-sectoral approach, multi-sectoral holistic approach is measurement. We have to measure the carbon emission from individual citizens of the nation and understand the inflow outflow, how much they are, what we call sequestration is happening or sinks are being created by that person and how much outflow is there. And then the balance of our carbon books should be there. So there are what we call as accounting books. They are saying there should be carbon books wherein we have inflow, outflow, positive, negative, and let's see if it's a deficit or a surplus. And for that, the answer is National Carbon Accounting System. National Carbon Accounting System. This NCA, the National Carbon Accounting System, is now going to be an approach, a body, or whatever you want to call it, which is going to be a generalization of this idea, but very evolutionary and revolutionary. Big words used again. And thereafter, it will bring the entire nation, from individual to household, under one carbon accounting framework. This is something which nobody has talked about previously, which is that we should also do what we call as accounting for carbon. And therefore, carbon accounting is something which they're talking about. Now, what should be the next step? Inflow and outflow should be taken into account for a progressive carbon tax, and carbon accounting in a way allows them to know if they are in a deficit or what we call a surplus, and how we have financial books, we should have carbon books. And the NCA will bring the concept of carbon books to the nation and will make it mandatory for businesses and individuals to declare and report their carbon inflow and outflow. Circulation of carbon will become visible as we have fiscal accounting, and therefore we will now start to have a more visible approach how carbon is financed, and carbon accounts and rupee accounts will then get integrated if there is convertibility, that if you're carbon positive, you can get an incentive when it comes to carbon concept itself. This will help India become net zero by 2070 and other countries also to create a certain type of regime. Now, as I said, big fundas, this was the nitty-gritty of the article. So let's try to revise what are the terms which you need to remember generally. First is polycrisis. Good word. Talks about the multi-sectoral impact of climate change, multi-dimensional, whatever you want to use. And we all know about it. They're interconnected. Now, how does this article talk about mitigation? That mitigation is through what we call as the concept of carbon accounting systems or framework. And that framework would in turn lead to progressive taxation of carbon, and therefore the larger approach is called national carbon accounting. Now, this is something which you will keep in your mind, and I will say it to you very straightforward that if in the examination you see these words, it is the way we connect fiscal accounting and carbon accounting, and the national carbon accounting may be something which the government may introduce. So, polycrisis, carbon accounting framework, national carbon accounting, 3 terms is what you have to remember. If you can remember these 3 terms, the article gives you at least something new to write in the examination and therefore can fetch you better marks. That is the only purpose, because all of this is in the air right now. The logistics of it, how will it actually be implemented, what is the problems in its implementation, these are not discussed. Maybe in a later date we can get something about this if it is actually realistic. So the first article talks about carbon accounting as the solution for climate change. If this is clear, and I hope it is clear, let's talk about the second article, which is the monsoons. Now we know that monsoons in India generally are erratic, and we have multiple things which are right now impacting the monsoon. So you have the El Nino, the La Nina, which is ENSO, which is the southern oscillation which happens. You have the IOD, which is Indian Ocean Dipole. You have Maiden Julian oscillation also. So the point is that monsoons in India is based on multiple factors, all climatic, all related to atmospheric and oceanographic factors, and therefore we can never really predict the monsoons, but we can have an idea. And the IMD has been doing a very good job in predicting the basic flow of the monsoon in that regard. Now let's take this year as a basic case study, because you need to know for the next 1 year, this data is very important for you. So with officially the 2023 southwestern monsoon season over and with the retreating monsoon now coming into flow, let us talk about what has been the general ebbs and flows and the general assessment of our monsoons, because you should know it for geography, for environment, and generally for writing any ethics answer or any form of answer in GS paper 3, because you should know that it was it a La Nina year, El Nino year, or it was a positive year or a negative year. Now, if you look at the data, very beautifully presented in the article itself, the first and foremost thing is that this time we had a deficit of 5.6% when it comes to the erraticness of the monsoons or monsoonal rains. Now in India, plus minus 20% is considered normal. So we will call this year as a normal year, though it was impacted by El Nino. Just to refresh your memory with regards to El Nino, because you should know it, you know that it is based on the pressure, the atmospheric pressure and the temperature across Australia and Chile and Peru in the Pacific, and it is related to the fact that what is the surface temperature in between Tahiti and Darwin and between the west and the eastern Pacific. When the eastern Pacific starts to heat up too much, it becomes El Nino, because it will then stop the flow of air or it will make it more stronger, and therefore the southwestern monsoons will become weaker. And when there is cooling in this sector, we call it La Nina. When there is heating in this sector, we call it El Nino. Standard, straightforward concept. And I'm not being comprehensive because this discussion is not about El Nino in that regard. So this you should know basically, which is that it is the surface temperature between Darwin or the oceanic temperature or the oceanic surface temperature between Darwin and Tahiti, across Australia and Chile, Peru, across the Pacific. This circulation impacts how the southwestern monsoons are going to get impacted. This is the major concept. ENSO it is called. And in ENSO, as I said, there are two. Negative year is called El Nino, when there is more rain across Chile and Peru because of the warming of the surface temperature of water, and that in turn leads to the equatorial flow to go towards that area, and therefore it weakens the southwestern monsoons, the trade winds which turn across the equator in that regard. And if it's a positive year for India, it is called La Nina, because it's extreme cooling of this high pressure in turn leads to a better flow. It's about the high and low pressure here, because if it's a very high pressure, it allows the equatorial atmospheric flow to be better, and that will strengthen the southwestern monsoons. And if it weakens, it then has a counter flow. So this is the basic point of what we call as El Nino or ENSO itself. And there's something also called IOD, Indian Ocean Dipole. Indian Ocean Dipole is basically based on how the Indian Ocean warms up western and eastern. And in this, again, to be very straightforward, very simplistic, a positive IOD is considered good for India, wherein the western Indian Ocean, which is the African sector along with the Arabian Sea itself, if it heats up too much, or there is a general heating of that creates a bigger lower pressure, and therefore the southwestern monsoons become a little bit more what we call as strengthened, and you can counterbalance El Nino. And on the other hand, if the eastern sector, the Indonesian sector, the Southeast Asian sector warms up too much, it's called a negative IOD, and that will impact the monsoons. It will weaken the monsoons in that regard, because the flow will get diverted toward the sector, and that is basically everything is based on high-low, which is high to low pressure movement of atmospheric winds, which will take the moisture with them, in turn becoming the monsoons itself. I'm trying to bring in a lot of static in this short discussion, but I hope that you understand what is ENSO and IOD, which is the pressure difference between Australia and Chile and Peru, which is El Nino or El Nino Southern Oscillation. And IOD very simply is the difference between the western and the eastern Indian Ocean, and that is positive IOD and negative IOD. Now, when we talk about this data, coming back to this data itself, the basic assessment has been that though it was an El Nino year, because of positive IOD, the impact got dampened a little bit. It could have been more than 5.6%, could have been above 40%, but the positive IOD allowed the El Nino to get dampened, and therefore, though there was an El Nino year, because of positive IOD, there was a little bit of counterbalancing. Now, this counterbalancing is very interesting if you look at it in a month-to-month basis. If you look at June, July, August, September, we've had a very interesting pattern. June was a negative year. Then July was a positive month. So June was a negative month. July was a negative month, positive month. Then again negative, August, and then again positive. So we had a major deficit when it comes to June with minus 9%. Then it was counterbalanced by July, which was plus 13%. Then August has been the driest since 1901 at minus 36%. And then plus 13% September. And this counterbalancing allowed the El Nino to get counterbalanced by positive IOD. And therefore, we got the minus 5.6% rounded off to 6%. This is June to September, minus 6%. Again, you don't have to remember this data, but I'm telling you that this is the erratic nature of monsoons. 1 month, very wet. 1 month, very dry. Now, if you look at it in the largest perspective of India, which states got the positive excess and which states got negative, the deficit, this is where it is concerning. See, UP, Bihar, Jharkhand sector plus West Bengal, most of the Northeast and Kerala plus Karnataka were in a deficit. While the Western sector, Rajasthan, Gujarat sector, we saw a positive impact. Now, if you understand the agriculture of India, you will understand something. Eastern UP, Bihar, Jharkhand sector, West Bengal, Kerala and southern parts of Karnataka are very important food producing sectors, be it rice or wheat, very important food producing sectors. And if in these sectors we get a negative deficit, it impacts our food production. On the other hand, in sectors which are much drier, we got positive, which is equally problematic because those states were never ready for excess rain or excess monsoons. So, though we had normal, the problem is that across India we had multiple issues. So, for most of India it has been normal, but the Uttarakhand and Himachal sector, there was much greater impact of even normal monsoons because of the rain and because of the rivers itself. But when you look at the food producing belts of India, there was a deficit. And looking at the data between 1950 to 2023, this year will be called an El Nino year, which is surface temperature eastern and western and central Pacific linked to below normal monsoons. This is something very standard definition which Hindu is giving you, but I've told you the basic concept itself. So it was the IOD, Indian Ocean Dipole, which actually balanced it out. But in the larger perspective, this was a deficit year and an El Nino year. We have had La Nina years also recently. The past 3 years, if you look at it, have been considered La Nina only. This is now the first El Nino year. But very straightforward, what do you do with all this information? Let me give you 3 basic things. First, straightforward. It is deficit, 5.6% negative. However, because we take plus minus 20% as normal, it has been a normal monsoon in India. How? Though there was El Nino was counterbalanced by the Indian Ocean Dipole, IOD, and when we talk about the larger impact on how our food producing states have been impacted, in the states which actually are important for agriculture in the larger perspective of a food security, there has been a deficit. In certain sectors, there has been excess, but most of Western Rajasthan is never ready for the amount of rain it got. And therefore, there were flood-like conditions in Rajasthan. On the other hand, in most of the Gangetic belt, as it is called, the Doab region, you have what we call as drought-like condition. So this is equally good and bad. And this is the problem with how monsoons impact India. It is very, very erratic. It is very, very regional. It is very, very scattered. And therefore, this should now be something which you hold on to for the next, when we get the data for 2024 monsoons, we'll see what it is. Is it just a one-off El Nino or is it going to be multi-year? But the simple straightforward plus minus 20 is still normal, and simple straightforward minus 6% has been the deficit, which is still less if you look at the larger El Nino years we've previously seen. And last but not the least is that it was a counterbalancing of El Nino by IOD, which allowed it to happen. This is what we've learned from this article. Hindu gives a lot of good data when it comes to these type of articles. We've previously also seen it for UPI and all. This time it was for monsoons. Good, important, hold on to this information for now, for the next monsoon cycle, because this will be relevant to write any answer. Thereafter, we have seen a major catastrophe, disaster in Sikkim. And this is based on the glacial lake outburst flood. This is something which was imminent. The ISRO, the Indian Institute of Science, has been pointing out that there is a major threat which is developing in Sikkim. And because Sikkim, based on the Teesta river system, has a lot of dams and hydroelectric power plants and general projects, this had turned out to be a major disaster. So as of right now, we only know that 7 people have been killed. 23 of our jawans, of our soldiers, are missing because of the flash flood which happened. And it's because of a lake overflowing into the Teesta, therefore inundating Sikkim itself. Now, this is not enough. This is not enough. Let's try to understand more. So the flood is believed to have been triggered after a lake forming at the mouth of, or what we call as, because of glacial melting of a Himalayan glacier, suddenly overflowed and inundated the Teesta. And the name of the lake is Lonak Lake. It is in the northern Sikkim sector. It's a high lake, 5,200 meters. But if you actually look at the lake, you can automatically understand how climate change and how this lake was dangerous for the Teesta generally. Let's look at this lake through satellite imagery. This is called the Southern Lonak Lake. This is basically the lake for you. This is the lake. It's a standard process when glaciers melt, lakes are formed. But this lake has had accelerated what we call as melting. And if you look at the data coming from 1990 to 2019, it has been expanding. It has been expanding in a way very quickly, 10 to 10 years. And the southern Lonak Lake was at the highest point when it comes to its capacity. And because the southern Lonak Lake and this whole system is very near to the Teesta catchment area, or from where Teesta actually flows, and this has overflowed into Teesta in that regard. If you look at the imagery or the real images from this sector, you can see that this is the Lonak Glacier. This is the glacier. Because of climate change, there has been an accelerated melting of that lake, and the lake has been swelling up quite a lot. And basically, it is been kept in its place because of a standard what we call as moraines. Moraines are nothing but natural dams which build up because of glacial melting, and generally when there is basic erosional activities done by the lake across that sector. But imagine basically it being held by a very, very, very fragile wall of rocks. Now what we believe is that this lake got a major inflow of water through a flash flood, or what we call as cloud burst itself. That cloudburst in turn led to this lake to overflow. With the lake overflowing, the Teesta saw flash floods in that regard, and the biggest impact has been that we have what we call Teesta 1, 2, 3. There are 7 dams which have been made, but the third dam is very, very big, which is called the Chungtang hydroelectric power plant, or the Teesta 3 dam. This is a gravity dam. Gravity dam holds a lot of water coming from the Teesta and is linked to the southern Lonak Lake itself. As of today, the dam does not exist. It is totally gone. The flow of the river has taken with 56 kilometers per hour water. This dam does not exist now. And imagine that if this was the way the river or was inundated, was what was dammed, and the water was in a way controlled. With this dam gone, there has been a sudden surge of water downstream, which is now impacting whole of Sikkim. So now you need to know Chungtang Dam, thereafter the Lonak Lake. This is the most important point. For you now, glacial lake outburst floods. These are very important words. Glacial lake because it was being formed because of the melting of the glaciers. This has been accelerated year on year by climate change. And glacial lake outburst flood, which is that because of a cloudburst over that lake, there was an outburst in the river, in the lake itself, and there was a flood, a flash flood in the Teesta because it goes through this sector and it took the water which was outflowing. And this in turn meant that all the dams, first, second, third till the 7th, all have been impacted. Multiple districts have been impacted, but this is very, very important for you to understand. So, the Chungtang Dam is a concrete rock dam, has been breached. The water has now though receded, and 160 hectares of the glacial lake has basically receded. 60 hectares has now been very simply become dry because of the outburst itself. But the point is, multiple sectors and multiple districts in Sikkim have now seen the impact of it. With the 23 army personals mostly swept away with the flash flood itself. 23 are missing, 1 has been found, and the ISRO and the Indian Institute of Science, since 2013 and for the past 6 to 7 years, they have been talking about the southern Lonak Lake to be a potential hazard, and the fact that we need to monitor it. And therefore, glacial lake outburst floods have now become a major concern in Bhutan, Tibet, India, Nepal, Pakistan, and very simply we need early warning systems for this, which was not in place. Now, before I go into the Prelims Bytes section, let me summarize everything what we've done till this point. We've done 3 articles. First article, what are the important terminologies which we need to remember? First article, we had to see what we call as polycrisis. In a way, if you look at it, first and third article are connected to each other. Polycrisis, in turn, national carbon accounting, and with national carbon accounting, we have the concept of progressive carbon tax. And the concept is very, very straightforward, which is that progressive carbon tax should be there, and how we have fiscal books, carbon books should be there, inflow output should be accounted for. The second was a very interesting article about the monsoons, ENSO IOD, which is the Indian Ocean Dipole, the El Nino Southern Oscillation, and we had minus 5.6% when it comes to the rainfall, because 20 plus minus we believe as normal. It was a normal monsoon, but as we see, the regional impact has been problematic, and because ENSO was strong but IOD was positive, which is a good thing. When the western sector, western Indian Ocean starts to become more and more warmer, that leads to a counterbalancing effect. So there was a negative which came from ENSO, but a positive which came from IOD, which balanced the whole concept itself, and that is why we did not go for a very big deficit. Month by month, June was deficit, July was one of the wettest, then August was again a deficit which has never been seen since 1901, and then September balanced it. But overall impact regionally has been problematic. Thereafter, the last topic we've done is the Sikkim crisis. and really Sikkim is in crisis. Now 3 states, Himalayan states in that regard, the Himachal sector, the Uttarakhand sector and Sikkim, all 3 have gone through very major what we call as river-based destruction, either through flash floods or overflowing, and this is a specific case of what we call as glacial lake outburst flood. So we know that Sikkim has been impacted. We know that it is a glacial lake outburst flood, and we also know that it is linked to the Teesta river. We also know that 2 reasons are there. The Lonak lake plus the Chungtang dam has been destroyed, which means that further down the stream, multiple districts of Sikkim will also get impacted because all the flow was in a way controlled. ISRO and multiple parliamentary questions have also been asking about the feasibility of dams in this sector. We need to reconsider the question that should we have dams on Himalayan rivers which are linked to glaciers, and with the way climate change is impacting this sector, should we go for these type of projects, because this is a live example of how things can go bad. And now a very prosperous, very, very peace-loving, very, very what we call as beautiful state in India has now got impacted, and the transportation, the whole national highways have been swept away. The same thing which we saw in Uttarakhand and Himachal Pradesh, they have been cut off. The people are in crisis, and now we need to see how we mitigate it. All of this has cost of social, political and economic, and this is truly a polycrisis. Thereafter, let's look at the smaller topics, which is Prelims Bytes section. I hope the 3 bigger topics are totally clear in your mind. Prelims Bytes, first is very straightforward. You have to, though UPSC has stopped asking these questions, but you need to know the names of the Nobel Prize winners in chemistry. You have Alexei Ekimov, Bruce and Bavindi, who have actually got the prize for chemistry for what are called quantum dots. Now, quantum dots is a very big concept, and the newspaper is going to talk about quantum dots soon, and we will discuss it in that context. But to just give you a very simple, straightforward concept, quantum dots are basically nanoparticles which have a lot of concentration of atoms in a small area, and they have multiple physical and what we call as chemical properties. So from using in LEDs to quantum computers, it is believed that in a certain frequency, in a certain way, the quantum dots can actually become the future of what we call as telecommunications. And from very slim solar cells to minuscule sensors, they can allow us to make these sensors at nano level. So quantum computing, quantum dots is something which has been in the news, static also. This is something which we'll discuss further when it is explained by the newspaper. As of right now, we just have to remember the Nobel laureates who have got it for the year of 2023. This is something which we'll build upon. Quantum dots based on the concept of physical properties of light even getting changed when they are pushed through quantum dots. In that regard, it is believed that if the frequency and wavelength is higher or lower, the color changes from red and blue, and that is basically we can very simply replace LEDs with quantum dots, and that could be the future of computing, future of screens in India and across the world. It's like that. So this is the basic point which comes through the Chemistry Nobel laureates. Thereafter, recently, just on Wednesday, the Defense Minister has released the 5th, what we call as positive indigenization list of 98 items which will be produced in India. But for you, why it is important? Because of this. Swalamban 2.0. Swalamban is the basic Navy indigenization roadmap. Now, obviously, don't have to learn everything which the Defense Minister has talked about, but this is the term I wanted to discuss with you, because indigenization, the indigenization of technology is very, very important, and therefore from tank weaponry to medium range, what we call as skill systems, which are suits, vehicles, manned, unarmed, and what we call as armored, from helicopters to different defense system, gravity rollers, and even producing some of the parts of the MiG-29K, which is a Navy-based system. All of this is based on a new surge which is there in the defense sector for indigenization and indigenous production of most of the equipment. Something again important for you, for this term I am discussing it with you, which is Swalamban 2.0, which is the Navy indigenization roadmap, important generally for your preparation. Next is again something said by the Director of General Shipping, which is the concept of National Action Plan for Green Shipping. And therefore, because India is pushing for a coastal sector, a shipping sector which can reach close to 20 trillion economy by 2047, the most important impulse here is green. It has to be 4 times increase of capacity, but clean energy, green tourism, shipbuilding and recycling. Basically, the maritime sector has a lot of potential to expand, but it has to be done in a green and sustainable way. And therefore, again in the examination, look for this, and we will see that most probably there will be multiple editorials about this concept of green shipping. But this is a term again you need to know if asked in the examination, and it's about environmentally responsible development of the coastal sector. Last, we will discuss a very standard, very straightforward thing, which is Ujjwala scheme, which is basically giving LPG to multiple beneficiaries. What has happened is they've increased the subsidy under it. It was 200 per cylinder, it has now become 300, and therefore under Ujjwala scheme provides free cooking gas to poor women, now at the cost of 608 rather than 703, 603 rather than 703, and the decision will impact 9.6 crore families. Ujjwala scheme again has been asked in the examination previously also, but is an important one. Generally need to know that they've changed the subsidy under it, and it will be questioned because it is coming before the assembly election in 5 states, something which is basically politically motivated. So, before we look at the mains questions, let me bring everything together. First, polycrisis, the concept of accounting for carbon, linked to the third topic, which is Sikkim and the major impact because of a glacial lake outburst flood. Coming in with that, monsoons, erratic. Some states have got positive, which never expected positive, and the states which are the food producing sectors have had a negative impact, though we will call it a normal monsoon because plus minus 20 is normal. It was ENSO which led to the deficit, but it was the IOD which counterbalanced it. And over and above that, remember one thing straightforward, which is that the impact of monsoons is overall not that big, but in certain states quite a lot. Month by month impact has also been very problematic, which is from negative, positive, negative, positive. That is why got counterbalanced. But this is a trend. Thereafter, we've seen indigenization of our own defense equipment, the concept of Ujjwala scheme, straightforward, simple, the concept of National Action Plan for Green Shipping, and the Nobel laureates who got it for quantum dots. 3, again, UPSC stopped asking these type of questions, but you should be aware of it for PCS level examinations. With this, let's look at the mains question. What is climate polycrisis? How can we mitigate it? Very realistic question for GS paper 3 with this term now in the newspaper. Glacial lake outburst floods are major cause of concern for India. Discuss. This can come in both GS paper 2 and 3, environment or geography, but again gives you a very good understanding of how a static question can be made, what is based in Sikkim in that regard. With this, I would like to end the session. I will see you tomorrow with another set of 5 to 6 topics. Thank you. Take care. Bye-bye.